The last bullet point on the specification for the approaches topic just says comparison of approaches. What that means is that you do need to be able to compare the approaches, and obviously it is part of the specification. So I'm going to go over that in this video. I think that it's something you should do once you've done everything else, really. You need to know all the approaches, obviously, to be able to compare them. There's a little bit of research methods in here. You can compare the research methods used in a particular approach. That can be one of your comparisons, so it's good to have your research methods knowledge. And some of the comparisons are also part of the issues and debates, the determinism, reductionism, nature-nurture, etc. So actually it's quite a nice synoptic one. For revision, it's a really good one to go over, because not only will you be looking at approaches, you'll also, as I said, be looking at your research methods and your issues and debates. So that's what I'm going to go over in this video. The sorts of questions, what this could lead to, are questions like this. Generally, I think they will be longer answer questions, so either an 8 marker, which would be 3A01 and 3A01 and 5A03, or the essay, the 60 marker, which is your 6A01, 10A03. This is just my personal opinion, but I believe that the comparison of approaches will be the more likely extended writing question on the Year 2 spec, because it shows higher level skills. It will ask you to obviously look at certain approaches. It's a more complex and a more difficult question to answer than just outline and evaluate the behaviourist approach, for example. And so I think that's where the preference will come from here. The question that I've got up there: outline the cognitive approach to psychology, compare the cognitive approach with the humanistic approach. That's one of the sample questions. So you notice that question is slightly different. You've got outline the cognitive approach, so your AO1, your outline, is just going to be the cognitive approach. Now, I've had students answer this question, and they would then outline the cognitive approach and then give me strengths and weaknesses of the cognitive approach. You wouldn't actually get credited for those strengths and weaknesses, that evaluation, because actually if you read the second part of that question, compare the cognitive approach with the humanistic approach, that's where your evaluation is coming from. So you've got those 10 evaluative marks here coming from points of comparison. So you need to kind of know what those points of comparison are. And that's where your AO3 is coming from. It would be very hard, I think, to predict which comparisons might come up. It would be very hard, probably, to have done every comparison sort of question before you go into the exam, and to have maybe model answers as you might for some of the other topics, just because there are so many possible comparisons. You could potentially compare any approach against any other. I tried to go through a list here. So you could compare the behaviourist and social learning, compare behaviourist cognitive, behaviourist biological, behaviourist psychodynamic, behaviourist humanistic, and then it goes on with all the other ones. So there are numerous possibilities here. So actually a better approach to looking at this topic wouldn't be rote learning an answer and doing every question and knowing it off by heart before the exam. It would be to know the skills of comparison and apply them at the time, and then practice those skills. So maybe pick 2 or 3 of those comparisons and give those a go. And as I say, that would be a really good revision task to do, because not only will you be revising your approaches, but there's some research methods and some issues and debates in there. So you're covering lots of different topics doing this. So what I'm going to go through are some comparison points and some examples of how to compare them. Now, again, like there are lots of different questions, there are a lot of comparison points. What I've got here, and I'll show you that question that came up, outline the cognitive approach, compare it with the humanistic. That is a sample question. I'm going to go over the mark scheme to that, so what's actually said and some of the comparative points. But I've looked at some of the other questions. The different textbooks take different approaches, and what I've done is come up with a list of possible comparisons. Now, there are going to be numerous, so actually, realistically, if you're confident enough, you could pick any point and compare an approach using it. Now, as I've already said, the issues and debates are kind of good ways to do that, but what I've got here are the ones that are from the specification and from the mark schemes as a way of comparing, and then I've gone through and I've tried to suggest what each approach might say about this list of comparisons. So consciousness, each different approach takes a different approach to consciousness. Development, and what I mean here is almost child development and human development. How do we develop from birth right up to older life? That each different approach will take a different approach to that. Emotion, the different approaches take a different approach to emotion as well. Mental health disorders, certainly that's one of the big things. Each approach, if you view psychology, if you view human behaviour and thinking in a different way, you're going to have a different way of explaining how mental health or atypical behaviour will happen. And actually, obviously, then that leads into treatment. So you're going to have different approaches of how treatments should be developed based on your view of how mental health has developed. Determinism, so that is one of the issues and debates. It's one that I'm going to focus on. As I said, I'm not going to cover nature-nurture, reductionism, all the multiple other debates that there are, because it would just go exhaustive. It would be, an exhaustive list. It wouldn't be an exhaustive list, but it would be a difficult list to absolutely cover everything. But if you're confident and you know those approaches, that could be a really good extension task to really test yourself. See if you can look at some of these other debates and see if you can compare the approach from that. I'm also going to look at psychology as a science, because again, the different approaches have a different view of that. So let's have a quick look. So consciousness, how do the different approach consciousness? Well, the behaviourist approach doesn't really focus on consciousness. It focuses more on the interaction between stimulus and response and the environment. So actually it doesn't have a strong opinion on the role of consciousness. Social learning theory, probably more so than the behaviourist approach, I would say. You talk about these cognitive mediational processes. So that suggests and the cognitive mediational processes occur between viewing an event and deciding what you can do about it. So that is the idea that, do you have the motivation to do it? Do you have the ability to do it? You're cognitively, you're thinking about that process. So that suggests a level of consciousness in there. And that would be more so than the behaviourist approach. The cognitive approach does focus on conscious thought, so it's these internal mental processes. What are we thinking? What's happening in the mind, in the internal mind, when we're considering an environment, a stimulus? So consciousness is a part of the cognitive approach. The biological approach would say that consciousness arises through the nervous system, through the firing of neurons. If you take an extreme biological approach, they could say maybe consciousness is a bit of an illusion, that these biological processes are happening. We think consciousness is there because of an upshot of these biological processes. You get into a bit of a philosophical debate there, but that would be the biological explanation of consciousness. The psychodynamic approach focuses on unconscious motivators. So it says that obviously we have a conscious part of our mind, but we also have an unconscious, and conflicts and maybe traumas that have happened in childhood get repressed or get pushed down into our unconscious, and actually it's those thoughts that are determining our behaviour kind of later in life. And the humanistic approach does very much focus on the idea of free will and the conscious mind, our idea of self-actualization, our view of ourself, self-perception, ideal self, etc. So what you might get is that any question, outline X approach and compare X approach with another approach, Y approach. So what you would need to do is you would need to pick certain comparative points, as I mentioned, any of those there, plus any more, and then you would need to say how each approach comes down on either side of that debate. And so obviously you'd be able to compare, say, the behaviourist approach, if it was compare the behaviourist approach with the biological approach. What you'd be saying is that, well, the behaviourist approach doesn't necessarily focus on consciousness because it's more about stimulus response, whereas the biological approach, they would say consciousness may arise, but it arises through the biological processes. So I hope you're starting to get the idea of how these comparisons would fit into your evaluation and your answer. And as I say, I will go through the mark scheme at the end. Development. So each approach takes a different approach to development, to how humans develop, to child development, etc. The behaviour approach suggests that we develop by learning through our environment, via association, reward, punishment. They don't necessarily say that this is just a childhood developmental thing, that they say that this happens through the life course, but obviously through the life course does include childhood. So that's the behaviour approach. Social learning suggests that this is happening, but obviously through the observation of others. So a child may imitate their parents, they may imitate friends, they may imitate brothers and sisters, etc. Cognitive approach suggests that there is intellectual and cognitive development through age, so our thinking processes increase in complexity as we get older, and that would be the cognitive approach towards development. The biological approach, surprise, surprise, suggests that this is through the biological development of aging and the process, and developing neural connections and brain structures go through different developmental stages. But this is obviously a very biological approach, physiological development, then leading to obviously the change in our behaviour and our thinking is due to the biological structures changing. The psychodynamic approach explicitly states that childhood is a really important part of our human development. You go through psychosexual stages, and this leads to different thinking and different behaviours, and you can go into more detail about that, about the certain stages, oral, anal, phallic, etc. The humanistic approach says that childhood and child development is really important. They suggest that we need unconditional positive regard in order to develop properly, that we develop ourselves as we go on and go through the life course, and that if conditions of worth are placed upon us as a child, that will lead to negative outcomes later in life. So again, this is another point that you could use to compare the different approaches. Emotion, I found emotion a more difficult one to find information about. So if you notice on that first slide where I have a list of comparisons, I've got some in bold and some not bold in font. And actually emotion, if you're confident enough, sure, you can use it as a comparison, but some of the others may lend themselves better to comparison. And what I'm saying is you don't necessarily need all of these comparative points. You can pick and choose as long as obviously you've got enough and you're conscious of those 10 evaluation marks that you're kind of aiming for. So the behaviourist approach to emotion is looking at behaviour rather than emotion. So actually, again, the behaviourist approach is looking at the observable behaviour, the interaction with the environment, and not necessarily taking into account the thinking and the emotional side of things. Social learning would suggest that emotion is learned through the environment. So obviously, again, how you would react to an upsetting situation or a fearful situation, seeing a spider, that will be based on what you've observed, your parents, siblings, etc. Reacting. The cognitive approach suggests more information processing, so not necessarily looking at emotions, but looking at, so one way you will have looked at the cognitive approach is through the memory topic, and so that looks at using computer models, theoretical models, so it's not necessarily looking at emotion, but focusing more on processing. The biological approach would suggest that emotion occurs through the firing of neurons and release of neurochemicals. Again, maybe similar to the idea of consciousness. It's maybe a byproduct of these biological processes. The psychodynamic approach puts more emphasis on emotion. It says that our emotional life is key, again, driven by unconscious processes, childhood experiences, but our emotions are important, and you do need to take into account people's emotions. Again, the humanistic approach, looking at the individual, well, that individual's emotions are really important. How they feel, their happiness, their upset, their anger, etc., is really important, and that would have an effect on where on the hierarchy of needs or on congruence that individual may sit. Mental health disorder. Now, this one I feel if you get a comparisons question, it's one you would probably need to talk about. And the reason I say that is because it's at the heart of psychology, really, and they're all very distinct. All the approaches are quite distinct, so it should be quite an easy one to remember. And again, that will lead itself to treatment, so I'll look at that next. But you can use those two. And then you've got two pre-made comparative points. So these are two that I would highly suggest that you talk about if you get a comparison question. So the behaviourist approach suggests that mental health disorders or atypical behaviour is learnt through our environment, stimulus response. You would associate through classical conditioning a neutral stimulus, the first time you see a spider, with a unconditioned stimulus. So you might be fearful from hearing a loud bang. So you see a spider, hear a bang, you associate those two things together. Next time you see a spider, you've got your conditioned response of fear. Social learning is learning through others, the observation of other people and how they react, and they would suggest that mental health disorders or atypical behaviour would come as a result of that. So you may have looked at anorexia, you may have looked at the eating topic in year 2, and so there is a social learning theory of anorexia that suggests that anorexia has come from the observation of others, and those others being rewarded by vicarious reinforcement for being thin, maybe on Instagram. There's stuff all over the news all the time about Instagram models, etc. So you now see that as an ideal and something to strive for, and if you achieve that body shape, you're going to be successful as well through vicarious reinforcement. You might identify with that person because they're a similar age and gender to you. Therefore, you've just learned to have a mental health disorder. Quite reductionist, but we're not getting into evaluating those theories at the moment. The cognitive approach suggests that mental health disorders are due from irrational or faulty thinking. Again, this can be seen in Beck's cognitive triad for depression. Again, eating disorders. The key here is if you talk about mental health as a comparative point, if you can use an example, again, that would be a good thing to do for the comparisons essay. Biological approach generally suggests that mental health disorders are due to biological factors, unsurprisingly. So genetics, inheritance, for example, there could be an evolutionary advantage for some point for these disorders. So OCD, for example, there is an evolutionary explanation of OCD suggesting that it would have been good to check your environment, and so now you check your environment, but that leads to obsessions. Or neurochemistry, so this is neurochemicals, an imbalance in particular neurochemicals may lead to a mental health disorder, is a suggestion. The psychodynamic approach generally suggests that mental health problems come from childhood and childhood trauma, repression, conflict, and storing those things in the unconscious. And again, multiple examples of that. So OCD has suggested that has come about through parents treating children harshly during the toilet training stage. It gets them stuck in the anal stage of psychosexual development. It leads to perfectionism. Family systems theory of anorexia. Again, that is a psychodynamic explanation saying that what has happened in the childhood and the family has led to a mental health disorder. The humanistic approach suggests that mental health problems come from a lack of unconditional positive regard during childhood, so kind of a bit of blame of parents here, that having conditions of worth placed upon you from parents, maybe, I will only love you if you're getting A's or captain the football team or whatever it is, and a incongruence, so a big gap between your perceived self and your ideal self. These things would be what lead to mental health disorders. So really good comparisons here, and you should be able to compare any two of those approaches against each other. And that then leads to, obviously, treatment. So this would be another comparative point. Obviously, if an approach is taking a certain view of mental health, it will then take a view that leads on from that about how to treat it. So obviously, for treatment, for the behavioural approach, they suggest that you've learnt to have this disorder, so you would unlearn to have the disorder. Systematic desensitization, for example. So you would gradually pair being okay in that environment. If you had learnt to be scared of spiders, you would satiate yourself to it. You would learn that it's fine to see a spider, maybe first by looking at pictures and then videos, and then being in a room with a spider, and then maybe holding a spider. That would, you're unlearning that phobia. Social learning theory, a treatment from social learning may suggest, and again this would work maybe with alcoholics. The social learning theory to addiction may suggest that you've learnt to have an addiction as you've been in an environment that people around you are drinking, smoking, taking drugs, etc. So to unlearn that, or to get better, treatment for that would be to have better role models, and so you would pair these people with role models that don't have that addiction. The cognitive approach to mental health disorders would suggest that there is irrational thinking and thought patterns, so obviously the treatment would suggest that you need to correct that irrational thinking, and this is where the cognitive and the behavioural approach have kind of linked, and cognitive behavioural therapy, where you start trying to think in more positive ways for depression, etc. The biological treatments, again, if you, as a biologist, you're saying, right, this mental health disorder, whatever it is, schizophrenia, OCD, depression, has come about due to an imbalance in neurochemicals, well, the solution to that, the treatment to that, is to give people drugs that readdress that and rebalance the mental health, rebalance the neurochemicals in the hope that will have a knock-on effect for the disorder. The psychodynamic approach, well, if, as psychoanalysts would suggest, that mental health has come about through childhood and repression and conflict in the unconscious, well, the treatment is to get those thoughts out of the unconscious. So it's psychodynamic treatment, dream analysis. Freud said that dreams are the royal road to the unconscious, so the idea that you would look at someone's dreams, look at what that may suggest about what is housed in their unconscious, and then work away and talk through bringing that about and remedying that conflict. Free association is a similar way to do that. You would get someone to say the first thing that comes to their mind. That would be a link into the unconscious, and you would hopefully resolve the conflict from them. The humanistic approach to treatment, where it says that you've not had unconditional positive regard, you've had conditions of worth placed upon you, well, humanist treatment is known as person-centered therapy, and it suggests that the therapist should offer you that unconditional positive regard. So that would help your conditions of worth, or get over your conditions of worth, help your congruence, but bring you more congruence, and that's the treatment. So I hope that makes sense, the link between those two and the fact that they can be two separate comparative points. Determinism is the next comparative point that I'm going to look at, and one of the first issues and debates that is possible to compare the different approaches to. So this is a bit of an example, but don't forget you can use any of the other issues and debates as comparison as well. So reductionism, free will, obviously comes in determinism as well, nature versus nurture, and they should be fairly easy, hopefully, for you to be able to apply. So something like the behaviour approach obviously takes the nurture approach to explaining human behaviour and human thinking, whereas something like the biological approach is very much the nature. And again, you would go through each of them and provide examples. So that's how you do issues and debates comparisons. So for determinism, I've gone through looking at the behavioural approach. It suggests environmental determinism because it suggests the way that we act is very much dependent on our environment, as is the social learning theory. So both of those suggest they're probably towards the more determinism end of the spectrum between free will and determinism, and it's what we call environmental determinism, due to the fact that the environment having an effect on us. The cognitive approach is said to be soft determinism, so it's a bit of a mix, I guess. Some aspects of the cognitive approach are said to be deterministic. So, for example, maybe schemas would lead you to think in a certain way, and you get things like cognitive priming, which develops scripts of ways to act in particular behaviour. You can apply that to the aggression explanation, the cognitive explanation of aggression. But obviously, those thinking patterns have got to come from somewhere. And so there's a bit of a discussion as to whether the cognitive approach is fully deterministic. So that's why we call it soft determinism. The biological approach does tend to be quite deterministic. So again, looking at aggression, it's one of the topics I teach, so that's why I'm using it as an example. One biological explanation for aggression is neurochemicals and hormones, testosterone. It suggests that high levels of testosterone lead to aggressive behaviour. That's fairly deterministic. It says if you're going to have high levels of testosterone, you're then going to be aggressive. So it's fairly deterministic. And again, the psychodynamic approach is fairly deterministic. It suggests that the way that we think, the way that we behave, is due to our childhood, due to repressed thoughts, due to conflicts, and again, that suggests there's very little you can do about that. So they're fairly hard to compare, I guess, but you need to discuss the kind of almost the level of determinism within each approach using examples. The easy one is the humanistic one, the last one, because actually that is the one that rejects the idea of determinism and very much focuses on the idea of free will, that we are active agents in our lives and that we can decide upon our own fate and our own outcomes rather than having them dictated for us. The next comparison, actually the final one I'm going to go through, is psychology as a science, and this is where your research methods come in. So you're comparing how each approaches the scientific method and the idea of psychology being scientific. So the behaviour approach tends to be fairly scientific, and again, use examples where you can. It tends to use experimental methods. For example, Pavlov and his dogs, Skinner's box, Little Albert, lots of examples of where the behaviourist approach has borrowed the experimental method to support its assertions, its ideas, its theories. And again, social learning theory is fairly scientific, whereas in the behaviourist approach, you're probably more likely to get a lab study. Might be more likely to get a field experiment, for example, and maybe natural experiment or observations. But it does tend to use scientific methods. And again, using examples, Bandura, that was quite a controlled experiment, a controlled environment, certainly. Then moving on to the cognitive approach, it can be seen as, again, very scientific. This is because the focus on experimental and empirical research, lots of controlled lab studies. You only need to look at the memory topic, which you should have studied at AS, to find examples from that. Loftus and Palmer's study, Badley looking at acoustic or semantic encoding, Peterson and Peterson, multiple uses of the experimental method. So quite a highly scientific approach to supporting its theories. And then moving on to the biological approach, further still, even more scientific, I would suggest. This is because the biological approach, as the name suggests, borrows theories from the natural science of biology. So biology being very scientific in itself, looking at biological processes. Again, lots of very controlled laboratory studies, and the biological theories and the biological approach are using that information, those theories that are backed up by that research. You only need to look at neurons or fMRI machines, where we're actually looking at a biological level to explaining human feelings, human behaviour. So the biological approach, again, very scientific. You then move on to the final two approaches in psychology, and these are the ones where there is a bit of a departure from more of the scientific method as the others have looked at. So the psychodynamic approach may be seen as less scientific compared to those other four, and your justification for that would be the fact that, again, not very many experimental methods done. There's a reliance on methods such as case studies, so you can use the Little Hans example, where Little Hans was having dreams about horses, and Freud used this to back up his theories. So this isn't scientific necessarily. The results are not replicable, not generalizable, because they only relate to Little Hans. There's a bit of subjectivity in there. It was well known that Little Hans's father was a supporter of Freud. So there's a big difference there between the methods used and the information gathered from the psychodynamic approach compared to the others. And then finally, the humanistic approach, where there is actually a rejection of psychology as a science. The idea being that actually experimental methods weren't appropriate for studying the whole person as the humanistic approach would suggest. So again, just look at the name of the approach. The humanistic approach is looking at the human, looking at the individual. So if you start doing experimental methods and generating rules that apply to many, that's not what the approach is about. And so there is a rejection of experiments, and you're looking at the individual person and their hierarchy of needs and their levels of congruence rather than making these generalizable rules. So those are the comparisons that I've decided to go through with you. As I say, they are not exhaustive, but they should give you at least a start, and give you the examples that you need to be able to compare these approaches to one another. As well as the example there of actually bringing other parts of the specification into this. So you need to back up your theories. If you're comparing one approach with another and saying, well, this one's deterministic, this one's not, or this one's scientific, this one's not, you then need to use examples, and you can use other parts of the specification to do that. I'm going to finish by looking back at this essay style question that I mentioned earlier on. It's one that's in the sample materials, so it's available out there to you. Outline the cognitive approach to psychology, compare the cognitive approach with the humanistic approach, 16 marks. So your AO1, your outline is going to be that first part of the question, outline the cognitive approach to psychology. So you'd need to make reference to the features of the cognitive approach. These are things such as unconscious mental internal mental processes, mediational processes, the fact that it's uses computer models, that it uses theoretical models, that inferences can be made, things such as schemas. So lots of that stuff that, if you don't know any of that, look at my video on the cognitive approach, but that's going to be your AO1. The AO3, the evaluation, is going to be what the focus of this video is on. So you're going to need to be able to compare two approaches with each other, and in this example it was the cognitive approach and the humanistic. So you're going to need to look at those two approaches and pick either some of the examples that I just suggested there or others, and then look at either side. And here, looking at the mark scheme, you can tell I'm not just making it up, I'm not full of BS. This is actually what the exam board are looking for. So possible comparative points there. So the cognitive approach sees people as conscious, logical thinkers versus psychodynamic, focus on unconscious thought through conscious, though conscious level is acknowledged. The cognitive approach, stages of intellectual cognitive development, including moral development in early years through teenage years, versus the psychodynamic approach, looks at stages of personality development, also early years through teenage years. So those two approaches, those two comparisons, are on obviously the latter one there on the development and the role of the conscious. You've then got the cognitive approach, information processing approach, and little focus on emotions versus psychodynamic approach, focused on emotional life and childhood experience. So that's comparing on emotions. Cognitive approach, damage to the brain and mental processes as the explanation for atypical behaviour, mental health. And the psychodynamic approach, repression and unconscious conflict. So that's comparing the approach on their approach to explaining mental health. Cognitive approach, see people as rational conscious thinkers versus psychodynamic seeing as irrational. I didn't really focus on that bit, but that just shows you that there are other comparisons to make. The cognitive approach, explanations involve active processing and an element of free will / soft determinism versus psychodynamic approach. Individual is passive and behaviour is determined, so that's comparing it on determinism. Again, as I said, any of the issues and debates would be applicable here. And that's what that final sentence says, accept comparisons based on therapies and research methods, application of all topic areas and to all of the debates. So that is saying that actually, as long as you know what you're doing, the there are many, many possible answers to these questions, and you may choose to focus on just a few, and that would obviously be a good approach to take. So I'm going to leave you with the last bit of information, or last bit of advice from me, is to practice doing a couple of these questions from the slide that I suggested earlier on. Pick a couple of approaches and try and compare them, and that'll be a really good revision task to do before your paper 2 exam, because it's looking at the approaches. It'll make you go over them. There's a little bit of research methods in there, and there's issues and debates as well. So I hope that is a good whistle-stop tour for you for the comparison of approaches. Thank you very much for listening, and tell your friends. Thanks. Bye.